My name is Ron Simon of the Paley Center for Media. I'm here with Dick Cavett, and we're doing an interview for the Archive of American Television. It's December 12th, 2008, and we're in New York City, 64th Street, and we're about to start.
Do I get to do any of the talking?
Go ahead.
Hi.
No.
Okay.
3, 2.
And I play to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what was your name at birth?
My name at birth? Ooh. It's not one of those elaborate ones. It was Richard Alva Cavett. Miss Carol Burnett, you know, the comedian. She always called me Alva on camera when she was on the show. She thought it was so funny a name. My poor father, all his life, got mail addressed to Miss Alva Cavett, which he hated. And he had to remind people that Thomas Alva Edison had that name. This is much more than you wanted on this subject. But
Well, we're just going to ask for a few minutes just some information about your early years and influences. Now, where were you born?
This is controversial. We lived in Gibbon, Nebraska, but they had not acquired a hospital in Gibbon then for their 84 people or however many people lived there. So I had to be born in, I didn't have to be born anywhere, but I was born in Kearney, Nebraska. Frequently, Hastings gets the credit. This is not one of the great battles of this century as to where I was born, but
it is a mystery. I was reading current biography, and
they're never quite sure
where you were born. Now, when were you born? Now, maybe we can have a specific.
I was born, I think it was about 9:30 a.m.
And
that's
the
what
date?
you wanted, isn't it?
Yeah, and the date, if you'd like to give it to us.
Oh, let's see. It was well after the Crimean War. It was November 1936 for people who believe, as some actually intelligent people do, that the stars influence our lives. Can you believe it? Billions of miles away. The stars, I mean, not the people.
And where did you grow up? You mentioned debate about your birth. Where did
Thank
you
you
grow
for assuming that I grew up. I was called Shrimp often, Shorty. And then one year, I, as they say, shot up about 5.5 inches in 1 year. That seems almost impossible. But I found a place where in the house we used to live in, where my father would put every year, he'd measure me on the wall. And I did grow that fast.
And where was this?
Well, by that time we had gone from Gibbon to the Grand Island, where Henry Fonda's from. No, he's from Omaha, but his house is in Grand Island, to Lincoln.
And now a question about your father. What was his name, and what did he do for a living?
Alva Baird Cavett, English teacher. Your mother and I, he said to me several times, when I would spend money on something, would have to decide in the Depression if we could afford to spend a dime going to the movies, or if we should spend it on bread, lettuce. And he taught high school in Comstock, Nebraska in the Depression. I know you're well-traveled, but I bet you haven't been to Comstock lately. It's in the beautiful Sandhills country of Nebraska. And he beat out 24 other men who desperately needed the job and had to get into suits, the only one they had in every case, surely, and trek out into the fields and have farmers, as my father said, say, "What makes you think you can teach my kid English?" And he had to try to convince him. He got the job. And the bonanza that went with it of $900 a year. People will think I misspoke. And for $900, he got to coach football, basketball, baseball, and put on The Importance of Being Earnest as the high school play. Wouldn't you have loved to see a record, if you could, of the Comstock, Nebraska production of The Importance of Being Earnest? I'm sure Oscar Wilde had a wonderful time. The two jocks who played Jack and Ernest left their makeup on for weeks. People, oh, you were in the play.
Now, how about your mother? Could you talk about her, and what was her
My
name?
mother also taught.
Right. What was her name?
She was, what are these names for?
Just for the historical record.
Oh, Arabelle, E-R-A-B-E-L. She was always known as Era. Richards Cavett. She taught also. My father and my mother met in Grand Island, Nebraska. went to the old Grand, as my father always called it, the old Grand Island Baptist College. And he said that so many times I figured over the door it said Old Grand Island Baptist College, but the old was his own. They got their degrees at Columbia in Summers and at Greeley and taught.
Now, did their educational background, how did that influence you growing up? Your love of language, did that come from them?
I think it must have come from them, yeah, because they were witty people. My father was always, I think, a little bit, not ashamed, but English teacher, to some people's minds, suggests a rather mild man with pince-nez glasses and dusty volumes and not very worldly, and probably not very tough. Thus, my favorite memory of my father is when I was about 5 or 6, and my cousin and I were in a bowling alley with my parents. My father and my uncle and my grandfather were bowling, and a guy grabbed my cousin and pushed him away from his wife. My cousin was playing with a lady's leg or purse or something, and there was nothing wrong with that, but this brutish sort of husband came around and said, "Get that kid out of here." Well, my father saw this, chased the man 2 blocks into a diner, cornered him in the entrance foyer, so to speak, of the diner, gave him a shot that knocked him at least 10 feet backwards into a wall of pop bottle cases, all of which cascaded down and half buried him. And I thought, that's my dad.
Now, you were an only child.
I was only a child and an only child, yes.
What
I
was-
couldn't imagine not being.
Right.
Who needed anyone else, you know? They've got me.
And what were some of your hobbies as you were growing up?
Stamp collecting, magic, and makeup. I made monster makeups as a kid with my friend Jim McConnell.
Now, could you talk about magic? Because that had an impact.
Yeah,
on your
magic's the
life.
best hobby there is for a kid. It will absolutely absorb you. You can't wait for your order to come from the magic shop in Dallas or New York or wherever. The catalogs, you go over them and over them until they're almost threadbare and binding bare. The first time you astound someone, the power of how did you do that is exhilarating. It could almost force every child to have magic as a hobby, and they'll almost never get in terribly big trouble.
That's one thing you have in common with Johnny Carson. Also,
Carson was a young magician too, and both of us, although he put the great Carsoni on his trunk of magic stuff, I did not put the great Cavett, but I had my own name on a trunk.
But your paths crossed as magicians, I read. Is that true?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, it did. Forget about that. I first met Carson in a church basement in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was the visiting magician from Omaha, the big metropolis of Nebraska, 60 miles away, and he came all the way to Lincoln. That phrase always bothers me. If he hadn't come all the way, he wouldn't be there, would he? Anyway, he came all the way to Lincoln and did this show in the church basement, probably for $30. And 2 friends of mine and I who practiced magic together went over to see him. We got there early. We went to the little theater in the basement of the church, and we knew he was behind there doing something. And there he was. And he gave us a dirty look, as any magician does when he's setting up. And we told him we were magicians, and he said, "Okay, come on over, fellas." And he showed us some wonderful card fans and manipulations. He was really good with sleights and stuff, the hard part of magic. You can be a magician and not learn any of that technical stuff. But he was very nice to us. Then he did his show, and in the middle of it he said, "We have 3 local magicians in the audience." We were in 8th grade. And we felt like we were on the Ed Sullivan Show. He had us stand up and they applauded. And afterwards we watched him glamorously get into his probably 49 Chevy and drive himself back to Omaha. But it could have been a limousine belonging to an Arab sheik as far as we were concerned. And he went back to Omaha and his glamorous 15-minute television show.
And speaking
If
about
Bob Hope had been there, it wouldn't have been any bigger for us.
speaking of high school productions, I read that you also did some theater. Winslow Boy is a production.
Did
that
you
I've
see
read.
me in the Winslow
I
Boy?
think
Come
I did.
on.
You were.
Oh, God. Yes, they called Irving Junior High School in Lincoln and said, "Did you have a kid who maybe could do a kind of English accent?" And the principal, who was a good friend of my mother's, who had taught at that school, said, "I think we have a kid here named Dick who can do that." And I got the job, and there I was acting with New York actors, equity actors, in a summer theater that was in Lincoln for years, in the Winslow Boy. And it was scary, but I loved every minute of it. And I remember thinking, when this summer ends, these people go back to New York, the magical Baghdad on the Hudson, when Baghdad was not an unpleasant word. And before the great Goodman Ace called Milton Berle the thief of bad gags. Get it, folks? And I go back to high school, junior high school, and they get to go back to New York and be in plays and movies and stuff. Felt very sorry for myself.
And you were also an athlete, too. You were a gymnast. Could you just talk about...
I was a bit of a jock, yes. Yeah, I remember my father once, as I was entering high school, saying, "It would be nice if you could letter in something." And I was considered kind of a bookish boy. Not in my mind, but other people's. And I thought my dad would like it if I could play football or basketball or baseball or something. But I don't. And then they were decided to form a gymnastics team. They had only mats and a pommel horse, or side horse as it was then called. And so I worked out every morning before school on that thing, and it nearly killed you. This is just a fact, not an opinion. The pommel horse is the hardest piece of apparatus to work. Every gymnast knows this. And so as soon as parallel bars could be afforded, and rings and trampoline, everybody rushed to those. So I stayed with the horse. So I was able to be state champion. Oh, it takes such immodesty to say this. You just wrung it out of me. Gold medal state champion side horse, pommel horse man. And recently I found my gold medal after all these years. And my coach took a picture of my state champion winning exercise with a triple rear dismount, which I'm sure you're familiar. And but his baby ate the film. I could kill that kid, and he's probably 50 now.
And you were getting information about the outside world from radio. Could you just talk about the radio programs that you listened to and how that impacted
Yes,
you?
I'll commit the awful cliche that radio gives you imagination. Therefore, we've got it out of the way. We're all sick of it.
Yeah.
But in fact, it did. It triggered something in you that television cannot unless you're blind. Because sound hits you deeper than sound and picture combined do. And the characters we know from radio, we have vivider images of than many, many we've seen. And those who can't grasp this seeming paradox will just have to suffer.
What are some of the images that you still have of that radio that you
I can see the Fresh Air Taxi Company offices of Amos and Andy. I can see Fibber McGee and Molly's living room and his famous closet. Jack Benny's vault. And when television came along, they were saying, won't it be great, you'll be able to see all these things. We saw Jack Benny's vault on television, and it was disappointing because it couldn't match, unless by sheer accident, anybody's image of it. Each person had his own image of it. And the real one, so-called, wasn't it at all. Drama was more thrilling on radio than it can be on television. It was an art form, a whole great art form that died. In England, still, there are some dramatic shows that the very best people appear on radio. But in this country, it's died. And we have boring right-wing bores who talk all day on the same note, same day, same week, same subject, never change their ideas. It's so boring. And same with the same left-wing radio shows. And it's just a waste of a fabulous medium. Yak, yak.
So,
Rush Limbaugh and I once arrived at a party together by sheer chance. I mean, and it was one of those where they have badges. And I reached for mine and I picked it up and started putting, I saw it said Rush Limbaugh on it. And he said, are you leaving anything for me? So he took Dick Cavett and I put Rush Limbaugh on me. And we stood there waiting to amuse everybody. And nobody cared. We were an unfunny Laurel and Hardy standing there waiting for a laugh.
now, when you were in high school,
I hope I didn't, he was heavier then, you know. And, glad to see. I probably upset him by asking if when he got on a scale, a card came out saying, please, one at a time.
now, when you were in high school, you were an athlete, you were an actor. Did you have any idea
I'm
of what?
ashamed of what I just said. Go ahead.
Did you have any idea in high school what you want to do for a living?
No,
Aspirations?
I didn't know for sure. I didn't know how to do it. And yet I knew that I was being called by the siren call of show business. And one day, the drama quartet came to Lincoln. This was a production that was on its way to Broadway, an unheard of thing. And Paul Gregory, I believe, staged these shows that came through the country and then to New York. And this one had 4 people that people over 50 might have heard of. Charles Lawton, Cedric Hardwick, Charles Boyer, and Agnes Moorehead in Lincoln, Nebraska at the Coliseum, packed. And in my pushy way, I went backstage, as I always did, and met the actors. And some props hadn't arrived. They needed their mics and some stuff, and Lawton was stewing backstage in his tuxedo and saying, I hate to keep an audience waiting. I loathe it. And I chatted with Lawton, and I couldn't believe it while it was happening. And I said, where are you going next from here? And he said, Omaha. I said, oh, you're going east. I don't know which way Omaha is from here. He was not keen on my company at that moment.
So you were doing a talk show back
But
then.
I was going to tell you was at the end of it, I went backstage again.
Right.
As the applause in waves and waves. They were doing Don Juan in Hell, Shaw's Don Juan in Hell, a staged reading. And I went right around when the applause was going on, and I walked across the dark floor backstage with them as they swept the way to their car to get on a train to go to Omaha. And I thought, I belong with these people. I heard Lawton say, Aggie, do you have your makeup box? I thought, I'm among Charles Lawton, et cetera. They go on to make more movies and plays and things, and I go back to Lincoln High School tomorrow. I didn't want to. I knew someday they would come and get me and take me to New York. Somebody would.
Well, before you got to New York, you went to Connecticut. Could you just talk about how you
Yeah, I
got into Yale University and why you wanted to go to Yale?
I went to Yale because a friend named Frank Rice, who had gone to the old Grand Island Baptist College with my parents and known them all life, was a Hay Fellow, it was called at Yale. And while there, he thought, Dick belongs here. He'd always been my uncle, who wasn't really an uncle. And he said, Dick should apply to Yale. And nobody, including me, took it very seriously, but I did, thanks to him. And possibly through the phenomenon of regional distribution, or the phenomenon of thinking we need one more person in the class, let's throw a dart at a map of the USA. I got in. And it was, I knew my life would totally and utterly change forever. When the letter arrived, you have been accepted in the class of. And it proved to be the best 4 years of my life, and I knew it at the time.
Now, what did you study? What was your major at Yale?
English. I was exempted from English freshman year. So I took a sophomore English, so they put you in a mother English class. And I took a lot of courses in that, and I took French and German and geology, a lot of other stuff.
Who were some of your professors in English? Anyone that we know?
A man named Cecil Y. Lang was my sophomore English teacher. And Richard B. Young was wonderful. Alf Kanan in a drama seminar. The actor James Franciscus was in our drama seminar, and he arranged to meet me on the way to class every time because he couldn't spell for shit. And I mean, he was a poor speller. And I would save his anatomy by correcting his spelling before we got to Mr. Kanan's class. James Franciscus later became a big star and did a series called Mr. Novak, in which he was an English teacher, which I thought was hilarious. I did a joke about him. I said every time he has to write on the blackboard, they have to use a stunt man. He couldn't spell. Yeah. And he came on my show once with a list of words for me to spell them, and obnoxiously I spelled them all. But that's a digression. Yeah, I loved Yale. I remember thinking, I get 3 more years of this. Courses where jaded Yaleys rose to applaud a lecture by the great Bernard Knox in classics, or the great Vincent Scully in art and architecture. Applaud. Not the cheesy, obligatory standing ovation that everything on Broadway gets now so that it's meaningless, but really thrilling lecture on Oedipus or Frank Lloyd Wright.
Now, did you feel like you belonged there, or did you always feel like the kid from Lincoln?
No, this is where I belonged.
Yeah.
This was for me. And across the street, virtually literally, those who've seen All About Eve lately will see George Sanders walk out of the Schubert Theater and into the Taft Hotel, and Baxter and Betty Davis, was the Schubert Theater. Tryout Schubert. Hence the phrase, the show that never got out of New Haven, or did. Moss Hart was there with My Fair Lady, and he came over to Yale. He referred to the ratty Taft Hotel as the hotel that never got out of New Haven. Every 2 weeks on the average, a new play on its way to Broadway.
Now, did you go backstage too?
I went backstage. When My Fair Lady opened, and I had sneaked into rehearsals of it and known this is going to be a great show, I sneaked in and watched Stanley Holloway rehearsing with a little bit of luck, and Moss Hart directing. And I don't know what possessed me. One night I put an overcoat over my shoulders the way I'd seen Moss Hart wear his, not the arms in it, very theatrical looking. And I took a copy of Variety, and I walked to the Schubert, and I went in the stage door thinking I've gotten this far. And brazenly I stood in the wings and watched that day's performance. I remember Rex Harrison looking at, who's this guy in the wings? Until the doorman got wise. Yeah, a copy of Variety. I thought you were the fucking actor, so I get the out of here, you little piece of shit. And that was the end of my... But I did manage to hear Rex Harrison come off stage and say to the great Kathleen Nesbitt, do you think it's our accents that's bothering them or what? He didn't think that night was going very well.
And you also snuck into other things.
Is this
like,
boring as hell?
No, this is good.
Okay.
Now, also funerals too. You snuck into George S. Kaufman's funeral. Is that true?
The quick version of that is that the Tonight Show, I was working for Jack Parr, booking for Jack, not writing for Jack officially.
We'll get to that,
I hope
yes.
the statute of limitations has run out on this. But there's that story I've told at least too many times of how on impulse I saw that Jack Parr worried about his monologue in a column. I was working for Time as a copy boy for $51 a week, I think. And I wrote Jack a monologue, happened to catch him in the hall, coming out of the men's room, he claims, but that makes it a better story, and thrust it upon him and became a writer thereby.
Now, what sort of
with a few
material did
steps
you
in
give
between.
Jack Parr?
Huh?
What material did you initially give Jack Parr? Do you remember any of the jokes?
Yes, I remember there was the first of the hijackings of that time, of a series of them, and the phrase pirate ship was on the front pages of all the tabloids. The pirates moved out, the pirate ship doesn't. And of the stuff I gave Jack on a folded sheet of paper, folded lengthwise, I say that because he came out to do his monologue and took out from his pocket folded piece of paper lengthwise, and I thought he's going to... I know Jack so well. I've seen every show he ever did. he's going to say, my writers don't give me anything I can use, and this kid came up to me in the hall and gave me better stuff than they ever have. He was capable of doing that.
Yes.
In fact, he didn't. It was a bit about mothers-in-law or something. So I began to shrink down in my chair, ashamed. I had gotten myself into the studio. And then some woman said, as Jack was in the audience with a mic, hey, what about those pirate people on that pirate ship, Mr. Parr? And he said, imagine, yeah, a voice coming with a loudspeaker. Attention, please, this is your pirate speaking. This got a huge laugh, and it happened 2 or 3 more times in the show. And later, I managed to get in the elevator with Jack, and he said, you want to write, don't you, kid? And I said, yeah. He said, bring me some more stuff in a week, and then I did.
Now, when did you first start watching Jack Parr? How did you get involved in Parr's sensibility?
I started watching Jack when I was in college, and then right after that, I got to New York, and my first year in a very depressed state, I lived only for the Jack Parr show and slept 18 hours a day and was only alive watching Jack. It was a strange thing.
Now, did you watch him, or did you go to the show, or did you just watch him on TV?
When I could get out of bed,
Right.
and with what I later were able to identify as classic depression had at that time, I would go to the studio, the old Hudson Theater, and I knew how to sneak in, and I used to say, hi, Tom, to Tom O'Malley and other staff people whose names I knew from the crawl. And I was the one that sneaked or snuck in. And later at NBC, I learned how to get in, too. See, I wouldn't be here now, I guess, unless you believe that fate takes other routes and gets you to the same place, if I hadn't taken that monologue to Jack. If somebody hadn't left a newspaper open over at Time that said Marie Torrey's column saying Jack worries more about his monologue than anything else, and it made me go home and type one. And if security had existed back then, but it didn't. Anybody could go in the 6th Avenue elevators right up to the place, walk into any studio until they threw you out. But no, there was no security. Nowadays, I wouldn't get my monologue to Jack in a million years.
Just talk about Time, and was that your first job out of Yale University, and how did you get that job?
Let's see, my first job was office temporaries,
Right.
where you could garner $10 a day by typing all day. And one of the best courses I had in high school was typing. It saved me from total poverty. Wretched job typing all day, but better than not eating. But then the copy boy at Time thing came along because an actor friend said, you know, you ought to get this because it's not 9 to 5. You can be 9 to 5 Monday, 7 to 11 on Tuesday, 3 to 5 on Wednesday, and so actors could make rounds and adjust their schedules and stuff like that. So that was the perfect job for an alleged actor. I had a kind of unrealistic experience too. I got the first job I ever tried for in acting. This doesn't happen.
Right.
I went out to an agent said, you can go to the Signal Corps. They're going to make a movie, and they wanted. It says on your resume you know German, and I said, yeah. And I got a job as a wounded German soldier in a Signal Corps movie. And then I got another one in a movie called Sylvanus Thayer, about the man who founded West Point. And I thought, this is easy. Everybody said show business is hard. You go get a job, you ask, check for a job, and they give it to you. $50 a day for 2 days shooting. I thought, I'm on my way. I didn't work for 3 more years. I got to be an extra on Bilko. That was thrilling. It really was. Phil Silvers, because I'd seen him in Top Banana twice on tour. He was on tour. And I was an extra on the last Playhouse 90 ever, done live from New York, with James Mason, Trevor Howard, and Richard Basehart, called A Hiding Place, written by Robert Shaw, the actor. That's archival, isn't it? And other things. I keep meaning to go to the archives and see if I can see myself again on The Killers, on The Hiding Place, on Bilko, on the Dow Mystery Hour, or Hour of Mystery. These are all things I was a prominent extra on.
Now, but after you gave the monologue to Jack Parr, he in fact hired you, became part of the staff. Could you talk about the show and your role in it?
Yes, there's a man trying to get your attention, but now I've spoiled it by pointing it out. His fly is open, is that what it says? Is that it? Oh, I'll check, no, okay. Could I get something moist, undesiccating? I have a...
Now, talking about Jack Parr and your
Oh,
role.
Parr, yeah.
Yeah, what was your full-time role on the Jack Parr show?
Well, first I was a booker because they didn't really have an opening on the writing staff at that point. So I hope the statute of limitations has run out on this. But I secretly wrote for Jack until such time, some couple months later. But in that interval, I interviewed people for the show. And all I ever wanted in that area of the business was to be a guest on a talk show. And I realized one day, I'm sitting in this desk at NBC, I can put people on the show. I've jumped one step too far. I want to meet someone who can put me on the show. It was the damnedest irony. And it was an exciting job because of Jack's extremely neurotic and quite thrilling personality.
Could you talk about that?
Well, I don't know how to explain Jack. His quicksilver, odd, impetuous, witty, unsettled, suspicious personality, and 10 more things you could throw in that list. To me, it made him the most interesting, the most compelling, maybe, face that's ever been on the television screen. The great critic Kenneth Tynan put it best maybe when he said that when you watch the Parr show, even if there's someone else on the screen who is infinitely more famous or of greater stature in the business, suppose he's there with Cary Grant, you realize you can't take your eyes off Parr, because if you do, you might at any moment miss a live nervous breakdown on your home screen.
Were you there when he walked off the set?
No, I wasn't working there then, but I certainly was watching. That was before I ever met him. I couldn't believe it.
Were there any clashes with the network when you were there? Did he have any questions?
Now, any great incidents with
Yeah.
Parr when I was there? Well, there seemed to be lots of minor ones always with
Right.
Jack. It was exciting. You woke up in the morning and couldn't wait to get to work. At first, I couldn't believe that the place where I would, if I weren't working for Jack, I'd probably be hanging out outside to see if I could see him go out and get in his car and go home. And there I was working for him, and it was. I think I said in the book Cavett that it was a little like what it must be like to have an alcoholic parent. The idea, how is he today? Is this going to be a bad day or a good day? People in this producer and staff would say, Jack's not having a good day. We're going to have to be very careful. And he would blow up at people and stuff. And I got in a couple fights with him and jeopardized my employment.
And could you talk about, this was the Tonight Show that we're talking about.
Yeah, the Jack Parr Tonight Show.
And did you know it was coming to an end in 6
I had no idea. And if you ask the average man and what's the other one? Woman. How long did Jack Parr do the Tonight Show? You'll get such a variety of answers that it's funny. I've had people say, sure, not more than 10 years, was it? 10, 12 years? Johnny did 30.
Right.
Jack did 5. You know this, but you're far from the average man.
Right.
And I congratulate you on that.
Right.
No one's ever accused you of that. But yeah, it was. I was, in a funny way that I didn't realize at the time, resented just a bit because the writing staff were not old men, but they weren't 1-2 years out of college, for God's sake. And Jack brings this kid in, and probably, typically Jack said, this kid's really good. You guys may be out of work, and it never occurred to me that maybe I shouldn't, because I wrote faster than anybody else. Maybe I ought to wait a little to take it downstairs to Jack, because it looks like I'm trying to make the older guys look bad. They were good writers too,
Who were some of
except
your
one of them who was a dreadful person. Bob and Ray had a character called the worst person in the world, way before somebody now does.
Yeah.
The worst person in the world has moved in next door. And this guy was one of the worst people. Woody Allen had warned me about him. But anyway, we don't need to get all into that. I asked the great David Lloyd, comedy writer, colleague of mine at the time, who went on to write Mary Tyler Moore and Cheers and Frasier and Taxi and all. We were schoolmates together. David said, "Do you want to know the best thing you ever said?" I said, "Well, yeah, sure." He said, "You and I were walking down the hall at NBC one day, and this worst person in the world writer came out of the men's room and waved and walked into the office." And David said, "And I said to you, Dick, what do you suppose he does in there?" And I said, "That's where he puts his best stuff on paper." This was quite popular around the office for a while, until it got back to him.
Now,
Do you want the tone raised at all?
now, after Parr left the Tonight Show, you began to write for Johnny Carson?
Yeah. Years before, I had written an Emmy show, as we say in the trade. There were other writers, I'm sure. But an agent had said to me, "I'm going to send you over to a guy named Johnny Carson's apartment. He lives over in York Avenue, and he does a show called Hootie." I said, "I know who Johnny is."
Right.
I remember going up to his apartment. There he was in his T-shirt with his telescope. And I wrote for him for this Emmy show. And then later, when he took the Tonight Show, he remembered me. "Richard, do you want to write for me?" That sounds a little like him, doesn't it? Yeah. I knocked him off his chair once. I know that's an expression, but you know that take that Johnny would sometimes do, where he would really laugh so hard that he went off his chair to the left, like, "Oh God!" I always wanted to make Johnny do that while I was a guest on his show, which I was a lot of times. Every time a Cavett show went off, Johnny would have me on and say, "If this one doesn't work, it's Armed Forces Radio for Richard." Always called me Richard. And was very avuncular toward me, and we were extremely good friends. And I was to his house to dinner. Now that may sound not so remarkable, except that people in the staff who'd worked for you were at Johnny's house for dinner? And I'd say, "Yeah, he took me to the Magic Castle. You and Johnny went out together." Okay. He really liked me more than I realized all along, until more toward the very end. And I him. And I would call him when I started doing a talk show and say, "What do I do now when there's an assassination?" Whoever it was in the 60s, Martin Luther King, George Lincoln, Rockwell, Bobby Kennedy, the list goes on. And he'd say, "Go out and do the show, Richard, and you'll fall into it. Something will take over for you. You'll know what to do." He was right.
Now, did you also remember your days in Nebraska together with that
Yes.
conversation?
Yes, we did. One night, I was in L.A. He found out I was taping out there. I hadn't particularly looked him up. And I got, "Richard, do you want to have dinner?" And I said, "After my taping?" "Yeah, sure, fine." He told me where. Taping broke down somehow, a camera, which never happened before, on the very night I was going to have a rare dinner with Johnny Carson. And I had to call him where he was. And there were no cell phones yet. Got him at the restaurant, and I said, I can't stand that I blew this evening. We just finished. And the restaurant's an hour away. And they were taken my clothes already, locked them up and gone home, and I've just got old clothes on and a pair of filthy white running shoes. And he said, well, come ahead, Richard. Stuck in traffic. Finally, you scream in the car, God, go around them, Jesus. Got there, nice dark restaurant, nicely dressed people, no Carson, and I thought, who could blame him? My God. And I started to go and fight back my tears, and I looked at the bar, and there's an elegantly dressed man, and I realized from the whitish hair who it was. And I went over, and as I got closer, there he was, beautifully London tailored, and dirty white running shoes. There were Larry King saying, that's a great story. How he got them, I don't know, but if you're Johnny Carson and you want dirty white running shoes, you're going to get them within 20 minutes. And he was so proud of his joke. And we sat and laughed, and he had just come back from Nebraska, where he had done a special about going back to Nebraska. And in it he said, I walked into the school in Norfolk, and he paused as I'm doing, and got quite moved, and said, and there were all my old teachers. I'm trying to act now. And it was quite touching, because people think, once at a roast I said, everyone thinks Johnny has a ramrod up his spine, and he does in a way, and I had some joke about that. And Johnny was thought by some to be cold. Well, he was one of the most uncomfortable people socially I've ever known in my life, and I felt so sorry for him at times. It was so hard for him. On the air, he was great. That's what he knew how to do. Not at the first. He had a hard time at the beginning. And Merv Griffin got better reviews than Johnny did. When Merv and Johnny debuted on the same day on the NBC network, Merv in the daytime, Johnny at night, me working for Merv before I went back to John. But he was moved about this thing at Nebraska, and then we changed the mood by getting to laughing about early inept sexual experiences at ages 11 and 13. I'd be happy to tell you those, but I really have to get out of here.
Right. But you mentioned Merv Griffin. Could you talk about working with
We were like two kids, in the barn, laughing and scratching about lost virginities and attempts to lose virginities and so on. It was really, really, it would have made a nice special.
Could you talk about Merv Griffin? And
Merv was the most professionally well-organized, businesslike, skilled, superb businessman, as the world learned. He just became a major tycoon. Merv was vastly wealthy. I remember the first sign I ever saw of his interest in money was when Dave Lloyd, Pat McCormick, and I were the Merv Griffin writing staff of his daytime show. And he had us in one day, it seemed like on the weekend, to talk about a possible game show and have us, as an ad agency, one man said to me once ineptly, just bullshitting off the top of my head, if that isn't a mixed metaphor, I don't know what is, and an unpleasant image. During which I said, Merv, what's in this for us? And there was a moment comparable to when Laurence Olivier in Richard III looks down in a memorable close-up at the little prince he's going to murder. And Merv said, well, how could I know that, Dick? It was one of several times when I managed to jeopardize mine and maybe the people around me's job.
Jeopardize.
But I liked Merv. Jeopardize. Oh, good going. Go to the head of the class.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, I think this is, have you noticed that on Jeopardy it says created by Merv Griffin? I swear Merv said once, forgive me, Merv, that he was on a plane with his wife, Julianne, and she said, why don't they do a show where they ask the question and answer in the other direction? And then Merv said, I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you know, Abe Lincoln and what president was assassinated. I think Julianne invented it. I don't know if Julianne is still with us. I'm pretty sure she is, and I hope she gets a nice piece of change out of it. Yeah, Merv was very nice to work for, easy to work for, appreciated the material, did it, and I owe so much to him because I was not considered ready for the Tonight Show when they came down to see me at the bitter end in the Village doing my stand-up act, where I was moonlighting while working for Johnny. So the fun was to come back to work the next day, and Johnny and I could laugh about how I bombed the night before.
Well, could you talk about that transition to doing stand-up? Was that difficult, and why?
It wasn't difficult for me because I'd been a performing magician as a kid, and I thought they're going to be amazed at how good I am. I'm going to go right on stage and be just swell, and I died horribly the first night in the bitter end.
Do you remember some of the jokes?
As it turned out.
Do you remember some of the jokes that you did?
I don't really know. The thing about whatever jokes I did was that I had strenuously written an act for myself, and Woody Allen I had just met. I started that, didn't I, earlier? Met Allen, and he had said, it's hard-ass work sitting down and writing for yourself. It's easy to write for other people. And it was always easy for me to write for other people. I could turn their sound on in my head and word it for Bob Hope, or word it for Johnny, or word it differently for Jack. And the great Mort Lockman, who was Bob Hope's head writer for so long, said, that's the essential talent. You have to be able to hear them in your head, otherwise you'll put in a 3-syllable word where they use a 1-syllable word. Groucho, whom I got to write for once for 2 weeks when he hosted the Tonight Show in the summer between Parr and Carson, I took a line to him once and he said, well, it needs a sightening. I said, sorry? It needs a sightening. I had written, you could have fooled me as the punchline, or whatever. And he said, it should be, yes, Sidney could have fooled me. And the rhythm was better. And after that, I knew how many syllables to give Groucho.
And also, one other person you wrote for was Jerry Lewis. Could you just?
Yeah, I wrote for Jerry Lewis on the catastrophic Hiroshima-like Saturday night 2-hour live show that ABC gave Jerry to do, on which he was brilliant at times and afflicted at others, and it was I think they're still paying off some of it. When it ended, about, 3 weeks after Kennedy was assassinated, and things were already going badly with the show, and then there was that, and the country was paralyzed, and the show ended. And I remember the last day I went to get the money I had put in the bank next door to the theater out to go back home to New York, and they were chiseling Jerry's face out of the tile in the front of the theater. And I thought, this is showbiz symbolism a little too extreme. But it's interesting because he's a giant talent, and it was fun to see him in his various moods and ways, and he's very intelligent. Though I did a joke at his expense one night with Johnny. Because Jerry used to talk about, I think he felt uneducated, and he would often, he liked to learn new words and things and use them. And this is terrible to tell. One of my nights out with Johnny, and we were driving past Jerry's house at night in dark Beverly Hills, pitch dark. And on his gate to Jerry's house was a garish purple neon sign saying, "Children at play." And it kind of marred the beauty of the night. And as we went past it, I said to Johnny, I bet that's all Jerry's read this year. Oh, I'm so sorry, Jerry, I like you. Johnny laughed, and that made it worth it.
Now, you mentioned that you bombed at the bitter end, but you became a successful...
Yeah, do we have to emphasize my bombing at the bitter end
but
quite
you
so
became,
much?
No, you became a successful stand-up comic. Could you just talk about that transition?
Well, funnily enough, the legendary Jack Rollins, who stayed and watched me bomb all the way through at the bitter end, said, "Lad, you're going on tomorrow night at the Improv." Since they didn't want me back at the bitter end, it was the bitter beginning,
Right.
wasn't it? And I went back on that night at the Improv. I thought ill-advisedly, and the very same joke killed him.
And that joke
And
was...
I'll never know what that's all about.
A lot of your
And
material,
after that, yeah.
right. A lot of your material in stand-up dealt with your years at Yale. Could you just...
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I have a treasured letter from Mr. Julius Henry Marks, better known as Groucho, in which he said, "I caught you on the Merv Griffin show." Incidentally, I didn't complete earlier saying that when I first went on a show, it was on Merv's show, and I just recently got a DVD of it. My very first, Rollins insisted I go on not as a stand-up, but on the panel. That's where you get the credit. Merv played perfectly with me, and everything went great. Tallulah Bankhead came out and wanted more of me, and a columnist named Jack O'Brien wrote an entire column called "Dick's a Fine Calmic," as I was calm, according to him, not a brash comic. Anyway, where was I that I now
You were talking
linked
about
that
some
up?
of your Yale years and... Your...
Oh, so I have this letter from Groucho saying, "I caught you on the Griffin show," on a later appearance.
Right.
I did several. And I think you've hit a mother lode, spelled correctly, with the yokel in the Ivy League routine or premise. You can mine this for a lot of good material. He was right.
There's one...
So I had lines like, coming from Nebraska, Ivy League, clothing was a problem, not sure what you had to wear. I wore brown and white shoes. The white one kept getting dirty.
Right.
That was kind of this.
That was picked up. That was your signature line.
I guess so. That and later, I've had 3 lines that Woody Allen has congratulated me on, and I treasure those for that reason, of course. Woody reacts to a line by saying, "Great joke, Cavett." And the one was my Chinese-German food one about a restaurant, a Chinese-German chef. And the Chinese-German food is good. The problem is an hour later you're hungry for power. That was one.
Now, you also appeared as a stand-up on the Ed Sullivan Show. What was that experience like?
How do you know this stuff? Yeah, I've seen that in recent years after many, many years of not. That was really, appearing on Ed Sullivan for me was through the looking glass for sure. I used to get graham crackers and peanut butter and milk and lie down on the couch in the cellar and watch Ed Sullivan every week. I was going to be on it? How did I get from Nebraska to standing in the wings of the Ed Sullivan Show, noticing that the stage was dusty, thinking you don't see that on television? I've come through into the world of magic, and it's faulty a little bit. Somebody should have swept this floor. A strange random thought right out of Marcel Proust. Anyway, yeah, I went on and I did well. My stand-up. I'd always wondered what Ed said to the comic afterwards that awkwardly held him on stage while his applause died, and that Ed's lack of pure theatrical instinct would have let the guy get off so that he didn't have to walk off to the sound of his heels on the floor and know.
Right.
And Ed stood like something hanging in a closet about 6 feet to your right and watched you, right, staring into your right ear, just off camera. And I thought, well, this is my last line. This is the applause. I'm now going to hear something from Ed. And I went over and he said, the applause going on, grasped my hand. "Nice to have you back, youngster." No, I wasn't back because it was the first, but I knew that Ed had elided the thoughts, nice to have you on, and perhaps we'll have you back, into nice to have you back. And then that show, the Ed Sullivan Show, lasted only a little more longer that year and was off.
But there were other possibilities for you. There was a pilot you made with Van Johnson before you became a talk show.
Wow, I have forgotten that.
Could you just
Not
talk about that?
entirely.
Yeah.
Van Johnson was great.
The
I
star
couldn't
of the
believe
story,
it.
yeah.
I was making a 5-part pilot with Van Johnson from 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and 100 other movies, and I was in the same room with him, and he was enormous. In fact, I mean, it was a show called The Star and the Story. Woody Fraser conceived, I think, and produced it. I'd sell it to ABC, and people tuned in every day and saw another chapter in the life of and the career of a star. And Van Johnson did the pilot, and the network hated it, but they liked the young man and thought maybe he should be given a chance. I'm not saying they hated Van Johnson, who was still with us at this sitting.
Yeah.
And they got me to try their daytime show. I only wanted to be a guest. I never dreamed of being a host. Once again, I'd gone too far. I couldn't put myself on my own show as a guest.
Now, how did those discussions go? How did you think about creating a daytime talk show?
I never thought about it for a moment. All I did was be scared and think they'll tell me what to do. I've seen everybody do it. I've been backstage. I assume I've absorbed some of that skill, whatever it may be. And when I first got out there, I realized this is not what it looks like. The audience sees two people. What could the problem be? But I see 6 people behind you, the guest. Somebody just lettered a sign and then held it up, but I missed it, and they've taken it down. Is this guy counting at point? And something happened over here, and the stage manager seems to be worried, and oh my God, the guest's lips have stopped moving. I have no idea what the guest just said. And I learned finally to have something ready, like, do you have any hobbies? Wondering what on earth it was following. Or my lady producer said, ask, do you pee in the shower? Everybody has an answer to that, and you'll think of it. And, you know. But after a while, getting knocked down by a wave every day and getting up to your knees just in time to get knocked down by the next one on Tuesday and the next one on, and so you gradually get into the rhythm.
And this was the 60s. Could you just talk about what it was like to do a daytime
Well, real
show?
men did talk shows then. They were 90 minutes long.
Yeah.
Sissies today do, I mean, my colleagues and friends in the business. You know what's a weird thought nobody remembers virtually, perhaps except yourself? That, oh, I'm doing my Lillian Hellman imitation of gut rumbling during interviews. They didn't give me anything to eat here. But that's show business, isn't it? What did I start to say?
You were...
Oh, it was going to be good. I had gone from not having something ready to say when the guest speaks and you don't know what they just
You were talking
said.
about the 60s,
And
90-minute show, Real
just
Men.
about the 60s. But
Right.
just before you said that, I had ready to say the most interesting and thrilling thing I've ever said in my life. Perfect for such an archive, and I don't know what it was. Damn. Maybe if we ran the tape back. Or
Actually,
is it a
the
film?
tape has just run out. So.
Oh, that's right. About an hour